Today's guest is Phil Robertson, a human rights campaigner who's lived in Thailand for 30 years and for 15 years was the Human Rights Watch Deputy Director for Asia. We'll be talking about his journey into human rights, issues within the region today, and which country he thinks is a human rights disaster. Phil, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
It's great to be here. Great to be at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand.
You've been in Asia, in Thailand for, 30 years, is it?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I actually first came here in 1990.
Right, okay. Wow.
I was working on the Thai-Lao border in Phayao, and then later in Loi with Hmong refugees. It was a place that was remote as you can imagine. When I was living in Phayao, if I wanted to call my parents back in Boston, I had to leave the district I was on, get on a bus, go 96 kilometers to Chiang Rai, go to the post office,
Wow.
and they would make a radio call down to Bangkok to connect to an international line in order for me to make a phone call.
Wow. So if people lose their Wi-Fi or internet connection these days, they freak out. But for you, I mean, for doing things like that, I mean, I guess you're a bit more patient.
Well, it was really sort of life in the slow lane. I mean, you know, the way we used to communicate was the office in Bangkok would send literally a metal box as cargo on the bottom of the overnight bus. And, you know, we'd pick up the box, and the box would go with us to the refugee camp.
Wow.
And someone would open the box, and you'd get mail call, and you'd get the files on the cases you had to work on,
Yeah.
and all sorts of other things. I mean, it was, you know, everybody was like gathering around waiting for the box to be opened.
All right, so let's just wind back a little bit. I mean, you're from Bridgewater, Massachusetts, right?
Yeah, well, I grew up there.
Okay.
I know I've lived in Massachusetts, you know, really until I came to Thailand. Although I did spend a couple of years in Washington, D.C. I was working on Capitol Hill, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Asia Subcommittee, actually. So it was a great opportunity to really get engaged in all the issues in Asia, and that's what really brought me out here.
Okay, but how did you get here then? I mean, I know you've just touched on that, but like, how does someone from the States come over to Asia and focus on human rights? I mean, you know, was that the interest when you were when you were studying, or I mean, you know, how did you actually get here?
Well, I mean, when I was studying, I was a history major. I was studying a lot about Latin America because that was the big thing in the 1980s in the U.S.
Right.
You know, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Honduras. But I was also studying a lot about Asia. And when I got the job with the Asia Subcommittee, that really sort of cemented my attention towards Asia.
Right.
And, you know, while I was there, I was doing a lot of work on refugees. So after a couple of years on Capitol Hill, I said, well, this is really great, you know, but I should go see a little bit more of the world.
Yeah.
Let me go out and work on the other end of the refugee situation, go out to the field, go out to the actual refugee camps. And the place that had refugees in Southeast Asia was Thailand. You know, at that time, there was refugees on the Lao border. There were refugees on the Myanmar border. There were still Vietnamese boat people who had arrived in camps, you know, the late arrivals. So, you know, it was still percolating. I figured, well, you know, I'll come out here, get some experience in the field for about a year or so. But then I bought a motorcycle.
That changed everything, didn't it?
And I bought a motorcycle, you know, a Honda MTX 125. You know,
nice.
had a nice helmet. And I basically rode that motorcycle all over the north and the northeast, went to every single province.
Wow. Okay.
And fell in love with Thailand, and, you know, have always then been focused since then, you know, on Thailand, you know, the people, you know, I learned the language, you know, and so I really became firmly rooted here.
So you said you came over in 1990, right?
Right.
So tell us about that first flight when you flew from the States. I know, I just want to go back because you flew into Bangkok?
Yeah, so I flew into Bangkok. At that time, it was the Don Mueang Airport.
Okay.
And the IRC had a car that picked me up at the airport. It was one of those old Toyota Crowns, you know, with the mirrors out on the front parts of the car and things like that. And at that time, the expressways hadn't been built. So it was like one road from Don Mueang all the way into the center of town. Fortunately, it was a late night flight, so it wasn't that much bad traffic. And I was put up at the YMCA in Sathon, you know, and I was like this is crazy. I'm even then, Sathorn was like a dust tunnel. It's like probably one of the least hospitable streets in Bangkok to walk on. And I was like, okay, I'm here. This is really happening. And the next day I went to the office. They said, okay, we know you have jet lag, but we're doing orientation. And I was expecting actually to be based in their Bangkok office doing various different work. And they said, yeah, we're going to do an orientation this week. And then next week you're headed to Phayao. And I said, where's Phayao? They say, oh, it's up in the north where the camps are. And I said, okay. So I'm going up there for a week or so. And they'll say, no, you're going for 3 months. And then you'll come down for a meeting, and then you'll go back up again. And I was like, oh, so I'm really going to be in the provinces. And, from that point, I was like, but as soon as I arrived in Phayao, I mean, it was just, everything was a visual feast. Nothing looks like North America here in Thailand. I mean, it's completely different. And within the first day or two, I went with the team, and they had the Red Cross Fair in the district. And I'm walking into this fair, with a bunch of other Farang who worked on the IRC and the refugee camp. And the first thing I hear is Joan Jett's "I Can't Stop Loving You," because they had the bumper cars over to the side. And I was like, this is surreal. I'm looking at all these different people, this upcountry sort of festival. And in the backing track is Joan Jett.
I want to talk more about Thailand a little bit later, because we can talk about Human Rights Watch and, what a typical day that would be. But at that time, just to go back, what would be a typical day at that point when you first got here? I mean, just tell us the basics of what it was like to work in the field, at the camps. I mean, what were the sort of things that you'd be doing?
So I was involved in the refugee resettlement program. So what we were dealing with at that time were these Lao refugee camps, which are actually composed of mostly Highlanders who are Hmong. There was about 30,000 Hmong in the Cheng Kam refugee camp in Phayao. There was another 50,000 in the Ban Vinai camp in Loi province, where I moved after 6 months. And I was living in the very scenic and beautiful town of Chiang Kan back before really there was any tourists.
So why were they there then? Just for the
they had fled from Laos. They had fled persecution. The Hmong were the allies of the United States during the Secret War, which essentially ended in 1975. And then the Hmong retreated to the mountains where they resided, and over a course of 4 to 5 years between 75 and 79. The Lao army and their allies, the Vietnamese army, basically hunted down the Hmong. And so finally, most of the Hmong fled, and they fled across the river into Thailand. And that was what had happened. I mean, the people who I was helping resettle to the United States had been in Thailand since the early 1980s.
What are people's human rights from a workplace, from a persecution, from arrest? Give us some examples, both ends of the spectrum.
Well, I mean, the most important thing to understand at the start, okay, is that there is a series of international human rights treaties that have been actually drafted and approved by all the governments of the world, okay? So, when people say like, oh, human rights, that's a Western thing, or that's the reality is that governments around the world have supported this. These things are done at the United Nations. I mean, I know it sounds boring, but there is a body of international human rights law composed of these conventions that have been ratified by different countries all around the world. I mean, and things that people voluntarily went into. The governments, decided they were going to approve these things, and they decided they were going to apply them in their countries. So, this whole sort of East versus West, North versus South, like human rights are for one people, not others. In fact, that's not true. And there was always like this ongoing fight back in the 1990s, certainly. But then there's also economic, social, cultural rights, which is, right to privacy, issues related to right to employment, voluntarily agreed to, no forced labor, right to form a trade union. So these rights exist in these different sort of boxes, but they're all interchangeable. They're all equal together. You don't get to sort of pick and choose and say, okay, this right is important, this one's not. What we see in this region, however, Asia is one of the worst regions in terms of the rates of ratification of international conventions. The things that we do see that they've ratified, they've all ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So this issues with a whole sort of gamut of issues related to health, education, quality of life, the best interests of the child. That has been ratified by all the countries here. Also, the rights of persons with disabilities, and also the rights of women. These things have been agreed to, but the more political issues, the more political rights, where some political opposition person might say, I have the right to speak, I have the right to freedom of expression, I want to say that this government is no good. The governments, of course, don't like that right when it's exercised. But if you boil it down beyond the sort of high-level discussion about these treaties and things like that, it's about people's freedom. It's about people's ability to also, defend what's theirs. So like if you're looking at in Cambodia, some rich man sees a piece of land that he wants. The problem is that there's villagers and others already live there, and they own the land. So he then uses connections with the government and uses connections with the military and the police to invade that land to try to push people off. The people's rights to livelihood is part of the economic, social, cultural rights, and they're asserting those. But then to defend that, they have to actually use freedom of expression, right to protest and things like that to try to defend their rights.
Right.
And then they get cracked down on that. So, it's very clear that economic, social, cultural rights lead into these other set of civil and political rights, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But at a real practical level, this is about people's rights to their community, their voice, their property, their ability to join together, to organize together, to advocate together. Another thing to say about human rights, which is very important, is they're also about non-discrimination. So this means non-discrimination across issues of ethnicity, nationality, sex, gender, sexual preference, sexual, all these different aspects.
Yeah.
That, you cannot treat someone less than someone else. Everybody has the same rights. The whole idea is that, of course, human rights, as connected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was actually adopted in 1948, Thailand and Myanmar were both countries that supported that in the vote at the United Nations. Or, was that ultimately these are rights that come from being human. I mean, the human rights movement was a response to the incredible atrocities that were seen during World War II, including the Holocaust. That, there had to be a different way forward, and that human beings had to have inherent value and respect for that value, respect through, a system of human rights. And that's where it all started.
Okay. Why do you think governments then don't want people to have their human rights? I mean, what do you think their perception is? Is it to not lose face? Is it for them to get away with things? Is there more to that? Do they think it stifles their own growth, whether that's economic or, why is it, like you said, in the region, in Asia, why is it such a problem then from their perspective?
The problem is that there's a nexus between political power and wealth. That, getting political power is a great way to ensure that you have opportunities to earn massive amounts of wealth. So, it's about using power to get money and get influence. But then also, once you have money and influence, you want to have political power to preserve it so that your enemies can't attack you. And what this then creates is a sort of zero-sum game in politics where, if I lose power, I'm done for. They're going to destroy me and my family and everything I've built. If you look at the case of former Prime Minister Najib Razak in Malaysia, in the 1MDB scandal where he was involved in, a looting of a sovereign wealth fund, that $4 billion, $5 billion. I mean, and he got a significant cut. He's now in prison in Malaysia for his involvement in that. But the reason he's really in prison was that he gambled that he was going to be able to win re-election in 2018, despite this scandal. And he had used the sedition law to jail opponents. Anybody who talked about 1NDB was getting thrown in prison. Malaysia. I mean, there was a horrendous toll, 2017, 2018, leading up to the elections. And surprise, surprise, Mahathir steps up. There's a coalition formed, and the people of Malaysia, in a courageous step, say enough is enough. We're not going to deal with this massive UMNO corruption anymore, and we're not going to agree to have Najib Razak as our prime minister anymore. And within the day of the vote and the next day, he's already trying to flee the country. He's prevented to leave the country. They impound his passport. Within 1 or 2 days, there are raids going on against these condos that he and his wife own, where they're hauling out thousands of designer bags and jewelry and other valuables. I mean, they basically pulled out something like $27 million worth of just, luxury items that they had bought and stored in these condos where no one was living. They were just using them as storage.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that kind of corruption, in order to continue that, in order to not be held accountable, you have to hold on to power. And this is why the whole issue of impunity is a core problem in Southeast Asia, is that, governments want to foster impunity because leaders don't want to be held accountable for the malfeasance and corruption and abuses that they've committed on their way to power.
Thailand, then. Let's go talk about how the challenges of you in that human rights role, living in Thailand. Then what, since you came here, 3 decades ago, what's been the challenges, at the beginning, in the middle, and today, living in Thailand, advocating for human rights here. Has there been an improvement, or has it been up and down? Give us a sort of a brief timeline of your role.
The long and short of it is it's completely up and down. We've seen some progress in some areas. For instance, the passage of the marriage equality law, recently by the Phayao Thai government. Very important, huge step forward. Something that people have campaigned for in Thailand all their lives. And that's huge. And that's a beacon for LGBT rights across the region. What I would love to see is I would love to see particularly some of the other Buddhist countries like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, simply adopt a recognition of same-sex marriage, of marriage equality. And so that you would have within ASEAN, at least half of the ASEAN supporting this, against the likes of Malaysia and Indonesia, who are, still caning people for simply loving someone that the government doesn't approve of. It's outrageous and unacceptable, what Brunei, what Indonesia, what Malaysia have been doing to LGBT people. So certainly in areas like that, there's progress. But, in a lot of other areas, they're not.
Do you think that Thailand has that sort of, is it a leader in that way in some ways? Obviously, there's issues to address, like you mentioned, and we could talk about that all day, but
I think Thailand, I would say that Thailand has been a disappointment too. Certainly, we thought 20 years ago that Thailand was really making the move towards, a solidified democratic structure where rights were respected, freedom of the press was very clearly ensconced, that, there was a sense that Thailand was moving forward on a whole aspect of human rights issues. And then we continually have military coups. I've now seen 3 military coups here. Every time the military comes out of the barracks and crushes democracy again, it sets the clock back to zero. Paetongtarn, it's still a little bit unclear about what her policies are going to be. But, the big issue, of course, is she going to be allowed to govern without hindrance? Is she going to be allowed to establish her own policies? Or is she going to be told by other people in her family what she needs to do?
If she was sat here right now hopefully we can get her into the club sometime.
Well, I mean, I hope so, yeah.
If she was sat here right now, off the top of your head, or 3 things, what would you say to her that needs to improve human rights in Thailand now? What are the 3 things you would tell her?
Well, I would first of all talk about migrant workers. I would talk about the fact that, much of the youth of Myanmar is now relocating to Thailand. And there has to be a fair deal for migrant workers, because the reality is that the migrant workers are going to be the new workforce of Thailand, particularly as Thailand continues to age. And so there needs to be a fair deal. There needs to be an end to forced labor, debt bondage, the police using migrant workers as walking ATMs to extort and abuse. There has to be something done on that. Second thing I say is, there has to be something done to address some of the historical cases that we've seen in the past, like enforced disappearances. We have a new law that now makes it a violation to engage in torture or enforced disappearances. What the government should be doing is proactively investigating the past cases that are still on the books. Give some hope to these families that something will be found, at least that they'll know what happened to their loved one. That needs to be taken up. And the third issue I would talk about is recognizing the importance of freedom of the press. What we have seen is a continued encroachment, erosion, and abuses of media freedom.
Is that local media, or are you talking international media?
I think there's a mixture of both. I think obviously the local media have it harder than the international media in many cases. We don't have a former Deputy Prime Minister Prawit, smacking a foreign reporter in the head because he doesn't like the question she asked, just like he did with that Thai PBS reporter. There needs to be a recognition that the media have an important role to play. For a period of time, Thailand was really on the upward track towards media freedom, and it really slid back, and that's a big problem as well.
Phil, you spent 15 years as the Asia Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch. Right. Tell me about that big chunk of your life. How did it work working at such a large, human rights organization? Tell us about sort of your time there.
Well, Human Rights Watch is one of the preeminent human rights organizations in the world. It operates on a methodology that is a 3-part methodology: investigate, expose, and change. So investigation is really what they're about. They work very hard on getting the facts correct, getting the facts right, double checking, triple checking information, and it's qualitative investigations. So we're not doing like a massive data set of 10,000 people or something like that. We're talking to people whose rights have been abused, and understanding what's happening and putting together what has happened there, and creating an understanding what the pattern of abuse is, right? Writing that up, coming out with conclusions and recommendations, and then exposing that through the media and through advocacy, talking to different governments in the hope that we will get change, that we will get the target, whether it be a company or whether it be a government or whether it be a group of individuals, to change what they're doing. The media plays a very important role for people understanding what's going on in the world around them. And, Human Rights Watch has been traditionally very, very good at talking to the media. And that was a big part of my role. A lot of times, governments don't necessarily like what we say because, of course, they don't like being accused of abusing people's rights, which they're doing. So sometimes we are not the best messenger. There would be times, for instance, like during the period of time when the military government was in charge here in Thailand, General Prawit was not going to meet with me, but he would meet with the U.S. ambassador. So if I can persuade the U.S. government or the European Union or other individual governments, with the UK, Germany, France, Australia, others, to look at these issues, to decide based on their policies and also their principles that these are areas of concern, and get them to raise it, I'm going much further down the track.
Right. Okay.
So there's a lot of time working not only to expose what's happening, but then also to get other governments who are concerned about the issues as well to be effective messengers in raising these issues with the government that's committing violations.
Let's talk about Myanmar. I mean, it must be it
is a human rights disaster.
Right. And
I mean, it is amongst the worst situations you can imagine
worldwide,
in Asia Pacific and probably worldwide. I mean, you're talking about regular attacks against civilians. You're talking about a massive number of political prisoners. You're talking about systematic and pervasive use of torture and detention. We've had people executed, political prisoners executed by the military junta. You have a military that operates in a way that treats civilians as targets. This is their modus operandi. That anybody in this area that is they view as an insurgent area is a target, which is a complete and total violation of the laws of war. This is a military junta that frankly has to go. It has to be removed. There can be no quarter for them. I mean, our concern, of course, is that at some point, in the pursuit of some diplomatic deal, the military junta guys will once again, be sort of let off with a slap on the wrist, just like we saw previously, where right as commissions of inquiry were going to come up about crimes against humanity committed against various different ethnic groups in eastern Myanmar in 2008, 2009, 2010. As soon as there was an opening, as soon as Tan Shui put up, Thein Sein to be president as his duly picked successor, all the international community said, oh, we don't want to talk about accountability. Let's just talk about the future. And the message to the military junta was, you can always get away with rights abuses. You can always get away with atrocities. And the people who have paid the price for that are the ethnic peoples of Myanmar, including the Rohingya, but also the ordinary people of Myanmar. I mean, you have a failed state right now. You have a conscription policy that is sending, millions of Burmese across the border into Thailand. People are talking about the number of Burmese in Thailand swelling to 5 to 6 million people. I mean, this is a crisis. And then you have the floods, then you have the conscription, you have the war, you have a Myanmar junta that is now trying to prey on remittances from migrant workers as part of their effort to fill their coffers. I mean, it is disaster after disaster after disaster.
Myanmar has always been a big topic here, if you're in Asia. But the issue is that it doesn't get enough international publicity about what happens there, especially in the last 3 years. What more can be done where more international light is shone on what's happening there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, what I'm hoping is that editors will understand that, the Myanmar issue, the Myanmar story needs to be told, and send people into, eastern parts of Myanmar where you can get into these areas which have been liberated by the PDFs and the ethnic armed organizations, and basically talk to people about what is actually happening in the country. I mean, I think really the media coverage drives a lot of the government attention. And so if we see more media coverage of Myanmar, we see more exposés, more, sort of frontline type pieces or what have you, that talk about the ongoing tragedy in Myanmar, then I think it creates leverage for the governments to sort of say, okay, we now have to respond. We have to do more.
This is a regional topic, transnational repression. That sort of, it's a new term that's been, a new term. It's certainly been used more. I've used it in my reports. Transnational repression, why don't you talk about what transnational repression is today?
Well, transnational repression is, what we've seen is governments pursuing their people overseas after they leave the country. I mean, it used to be that in many countries, if someone was facing political persecution and they ran away, went to a third country, perhaps seeking third country resettlement or something like that, that the government would be like, okay, they're gone. See you later. Bye-bye. But now what we have is countries like China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, who are actively pursuing their dissidents outside of the country. There's a treaty on sort of dealing with fugitives between Thailand and Cambodia that was signed during the military regime of General Pawit here and Prayut. But Pawit was the key guy who was behind the scenes, making these arrangements. And we had people who were literally abducted and taken back to Cambodia, political dissidents, people who were recognized refugees by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. And, we've had this time and time again. We actually put out a report, Human Rights Watch put out a report in mid-May about this issue. So it's a big problem. In Cambodia, what we really have is now old wine in a new bottle. Hun Manet is as bad or worse than his father in terms of human rights abuses. He is not a reformer. He is a tyrant. And what we're seeing is a crushing effort to wipe out what remains of critical civil society in Cambodia. We've got senior NGO people fleeing to Thailand. We've got opposition political party people, arrests happening. We've got environmentalists. We've got youth. It's just like an onslaught. I mean, in some ways, what we see is like Cambodia is trying to replicate the China model of wiping out civil society.
Is this an increasingly growing problem in Asia? This has always happened, right? I mean, has it always happened to the degree of what we're seeing now?
I think what's happened is we now have a label for it.
Right.
Courtesy of Freedom House and others who called it transnational repression.
Yeah.
What they've done is they've labeled a phenomenon that has existed for a while, but which has intensified over the past 10 years.
Okay. In 2022, Qatar held the FIFA World Cup, or soccer is what you would say in America. But there was a lot of sports pundits who were ex-players, ex-professionals, who were criticizing the location of the World Cup being held there. Yet they still went there and worked and talked about the football and the World Cup, and they got paid, I'm assuming, a lot of money for it. So there was criticism from the public, especially the British public, that they were criticizing the location, but that they went there and they, I went to the World Cup personally and look for, I didn't obviously go into the human rights issues, but I'm a big football fan. But the point is, what I'm trying to make is that should people be deterred and discouraged from going to countries that they don't agree with their human rights record or or what's happening there? Yeah. Or do you advocate for people to go there and see for themselves what's happening? What do you think?
Well, I mean, look, I think there's a couple pieces here that you need to talk about. There's one very clear global trend of what we call sports washing, where you have countries like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia in particular, Kuwait, and others who are trying to use professional sports and their engagement as professional sports to try to wash away concerns about their human rights.
Hence the term for it. Yeah,
sports washing.
Right.
The big beef on Qatar was, in fact, not only that it's an autocracy, but also that the way that the people who built the venues for the World Cup, who were mostly migrant workers from South Asia, were treated. Dangerous and dirty working conditions, people dying of heat exposure, all these things, where there wasn't any sort of focus by the government to ensure that, these people not only could work, but also at the end of the day would earn money that they were promised and return home safely. And that's a big issue. So, I mean, I think there's a global trend and there needs to be more attention, I think, on some of these sports bodies that, they have to stand up for human rights. People traveling to a country, it's like, oh, I'm going to travel to the country, and by being there, I'm going to embody human rights. It doesn't really happen that way. People travel because they want to travel.
Right.
And they figure out the justification after the fact. What I would say is that if people are concerned about human rights in sports, they should be, for instance, campaigning now for global sports authorities like FIFA and others to ensure that human rights are respected if the World Cup is held in Saudi Arabia.
What are the most misunderstood things about human rights? The most misunderstood?
What is easily the most misunderstood concept about human rights is that somehow human rights are different for depending on who the person is or what the country is. They're not. It's a universal system. As I said, it's a universal system that the governments created themselves. I mean, the people who are drafting all the international human rights treaties that have now been adopted by the UN and have been ratified by governments, it wasn't the NGOs who was doing it. It wasn't Human Rights Watch. It was the governments. And so, for the governments to claim that, human rights don't apply to them when they, in fact, were part of the people who are drafting the treaties and ensuring that they were adopted by the UN General Assembly, where only the governments have the right to vote, it's hypocritical. It is a system that has been adopted by the entire world. And anybody who says to you that, human rights don't apply here because of this sovereignty issue, or because we're different, or because our government is different, or the culture is different, the bottom line is that human rights are universal. And they were created in a system that way, and they were created by the governments themselves who are now criticizing them when it turns out to be convenient for them.
Okay, Phil, look, we talked about a lot today, so thanks so much. It's been really interesting, really fascinating to hear your experiences and knowledge about human rights. So thanks again, and we'll speak soon for sure. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Dateline Bangkok is available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So please like, follow, share, and subscribe. And feel free to check the FCCT's website and social media for upcoming events here at the club. And stay tuned for more interesting guests on this podcast in the coming weeks.